Sweat dripped onto cold metal, acidic and warm. Riley adjusted her frayed collar, feeling the heavy stares of the elite cadets burning into her back. They snickered at the rusted insignia on her shoulder. To them, it was garbage. To her, it was a gravestone. Keep listening to find out why the Academy's deadliest instructor didn't laugh. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a grating synthetic hum, casting sterile shadows across the polished deck of the prep room. Riley picked at a loose thread on her left cuff. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the edges jagged and rimmed with grease she couldn't scrub out, no matter how hard she tried. She tasted pennies. Fear always tasted like copper in her mouth. Around her, the children of the core worlds adjusted their gear. Their environmental suits hissed, perfectly calibrated servos whirring in smooth, silent harmony. They smelled of expensive ozone sprays and citrus talc. Riley smelled like damp canvas, stale sweat, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap engine solvent. She hugged her arms across her chest, trying to make herself smaller. It didn't work. She stuck out like a rusted nail in a surgical ward. Her jacket was a heavy olive-drab monstrosity made of organic cotton and spun polyaramid. It was 3 sizes too big, bunching at her waist, the cuffs rolled back twice so she could use her hands. It was the only piece of atmospheric gear she owned, hauled out of a footlocker that had sat in her grandfather's damp basement for 50 years. Is that a historical reenactment piece, Mercer? Riley stiffened. She didn't turn around. She focused her eyes on the locker in front of her, watching the distorted reflection in its pristine durasteel surface. Cassidy stood there, flanked by 2 equally polished sycophants. Cassidy wore a sleek midnight blue tactical rig that fit her like a second skin. Not a single crease, not a speck of dust. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe regulation braid that still managed to look like it belonged on a recruitment poster. "I asked you a question, scavenger," Cassidy said, taking a step closer. The slick sound of her rubberized boots on the deck plating made Riley's stomach turn. "It's just a jacket," Riley muttered. Her voice cracked. She hated herself for that. She wanted to sound tough, indifferent. Instead, she sounded like a scared kid from the outer colonies who hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. Which she was. Jax, one of Cassidy's shadows, snorted. He leaned in, invading Riley's personal space. He smelled heavily of synthetic mint. "Looks like you dug it out of a landfill. What's that smell?" "Mildew and failure." Riley gripped the edges of her open locker. The cold metal bit into her palms. She needed this academy slot. The stipend alone meant her mother wouldn't freeze this winter on New Anchorage. She couldn't afford to throw a punch, no matter how badly her muscles twitched with the urge. "Leave it alone," Riley said, her gaze dropping to the floor. Cassidy laughed. It wasn't a cruel, booming laugh. It was a light, breathy sound, which made it infinitely worse. It was the laugh of someone observing an interesting, slightly pathetic insect. She reached out and tapped the shoulder of Riley's jacket. Riley flinched, pulling away, but Cassidy's manicured finger had already found its target. Sewn into the heavy canvas of the right shoulder was an insignia. It wasn't a glowing holographic projection or a smartweave patch that updated with the wearer's vitals. It was cloth. Dirty, faded cloth. A tarnished silver anchor, cracked down the middle, wrapped in a jagged loop of rusted barbed wire. The threads holding it to the jacket were thick and uneven, sewn by hands that were likely shaking at the time. "What even is this?" Cassidy asked, her tone dripping with mock curiosity. "Did your grandma sew it for you? Some kind of quaint earth animal?" "It's an anchor," Riley said, her jaw tight. "An anchor," Jax repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What? Like for boats on water?" The concept seemed utterly alien to him. Who uses water vessels anymore? "Did you bring a musket to the plasma range too?" A few other cadets nearby chuckled, their eyes sliding over Riley's ragged appearance before returning to their own pristine reflections. "It's old," Riley said. She didn't want to explain it. She didn't really know the full history anyway. Her grandfather had never talked about it. He just drank cheap synth whiskey and stared at the static on the vidscreen, rubbing his thumb over that patch until the fabric wore thin. When he died, the jacket was the only thing of value left in the house. Kept the biting wind out. That was all she cared about. It's a health hazard, is what it is? Cassidy sneered, stepping back and wiping her finger on her thigh as if the patch had infected her. Instructor Griggs is going to vaporize you during inspection. You're making the whole squad look like a refugee camp. Riley closed her eyes. Her chest tightened. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on her lungs. Cassidy was right. She didn't belong here. The Zenith Coalition Academy was for the elite, the groomed, the genetically optimized. Riley was a mechanic's daughter who had scored high on a tactical aptitude test by sheer dumb luck, thrown into a world of wealth and polish she couldn't comprehend. Her hands shook. She shoved them deep into the oversized pockets of the jacket, feeling the rough, worn lining. She wanted to run. She wanted to strip the jacket off and disappear into the ventilation shafts. But the thought of the freezing hablock on New Anchorage kept her feet glued to the floor. "Just let me be, Cassidy?" Riley whispered, a pathetic tremor in her voice. She hated her own weakness. She hated the sting of tears threatening the corners of her eyes. "Oh, don't cry, scavenger," Jax mocked, leaning in again. "Maybe Griggs will take pity on you. Maybe he'll let you clean the latrines instead of kicking you out the airlock." The warning klaxon blared overhead, a harsh two-tone wail that cut through the low murmur of the prep room. Inspection. The cadets scrambled into a perfect uniform line. Boots slammed in unison. Chests puffed out. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Riley stumbled into line at the very end, her oversized jacket flapping. She tried to stand at attention, but her boots were a size too large, and her posture was ruined by years of hunched labor. She was breathing too fast. The collar of the jacket felt like a noose. She stared straight ahead at the gray bulkhead, waiting for the executioner to arrive. Heavy mag boots hit the deck plating. Clank, clank, clank. The sound was rhythmic, heavy, and completely devoid of hurry. The prep room doors hissed open, revealing Instructor Griggs. Riley caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye and swallowed hard. Griggs wasn't a polished core world officer. He was a relic. The left side of his face was a tapestry of burned scars that looked like melted wax, twisting his mouth into a permanent, cynical sneer. His right eye was organic, a pale, washed-out blue. His left was a crude cybernetic implant glowing with a dull, aggressive red light that whirred as it focused. He smelled distinctly of stale recaf, cheap tobacco, and gun oil. He moved down the line. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the atmospheric scrubbers and the heavy footfalls of the instructor. Griggs didn't yell. He didn't pace frantically. He stopped in front of each cadet, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. He stopped in front of Jax. Riley could hear Jax holding his breath. Griggs leaned in close. The servos in his cybernetic neck joint whirred softly. "Your primary battery housing is smudged, cadet," Griggs said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding in a rusted cement mixer. "Sir, I polished it this morning, sir," Jax barked, his voice entirely too loud. "Then you are both incompetent and blind," Griggs replied softly. He reached out with a hand encased in a battered leather glove and tapped Jax's chest plate. "2 demerits. If you go into a vacuum with compromised seals because you were too busy looking at your own reflection to check your gaskets, you will die, and I will not fill out the paperwork for a moron." Jax swallowed. Griggs moved on. He stopped in front of Cassidy. He looked her up and down. Her gear was flawless. Even Griggs couldn't find a smudge. But he didn't look impressed. He looked bored. "Very pretty, cadet," Griggs muttered. "You look like you're going to a costume party. Let's hope the plasma fire doesn't ruin your manicure." Cassidy's jaw clenched, but she kept her eyes forward. Riley's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her palms were slick with sweat inside her pockets. He was coming. The heavy steps drew closer. Clank, clank. Griggs stopped. He was standing directly in front of her. Riley kept her eyes locked on the bulkhead ahead. Her vision blurred slightly. She braced herself for the insult, for the immediate dismissal. She knew how terrible she looked. Her canvas jacket was practically an insult to the pristine armor around her. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Griggs just stood there. Riley heard Cassidy whisper down the line, a barely audible hiss. "Here it comes. Bye-bye, scavenger." Griggs slowly turned his head. His organic eye squinted. His cybernetic lens clicked, zooming in with a faint mechanical whir. He wasn't looking at Riley's face. He wasn't looking at her unpolished boots. He was staring at her right shoulder. Riley held her breath. Her lungs ached. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, waiting for the explosion. Griggs took a half-step forward. The smell of gun oil and tobacco was overwhelming now. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he raised his right hand. He didn't wear a glove on this hand. It was fully synthetic, exposed pistons and scarred metal plating. His metal fingertips touched the rough, frayed edge of the patch. Riley flinched, pulling her shoulder back instinctively. "I can take it off, sir," she stammered, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a panicked rush. "I couldn't afford the requisition fee for the standard rig, but I can." "Shut up." The words weren't a bark. They were a whisper, a ragged, hollow whisper that sounded like it had been scraped out of the bottom of a dry well. Riley froze. Griggs's metal fingers traced the cracked silver anchor. He felt the rusted wire embroidered into the canvas. His hand was shaking. The servos in his wrist whined, struggling against a tremor that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. He stood there for a long time. The oppressive silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the tense silence of impending discipline. It was heavy, suffocating. "Where did you get this?" Griggs asked, his voice cracking. Riley blinked, completely thrown off guard. The cynical, terrifying instructor sounded fragile. My grandfather, sir," Riley whispered, her throat tight. "It was his from before I was born." Griggs closed his eyes. His organic eye watered, a single tear catching in the deep web of scars beneath it. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He pulled his hand back from the patch as if it were burning hot. "He was on Tartarus," Griggs said softly. Not a question, but a statement of absolute fact. Riley frowned, confused. "Tartarus? I don't know, sir. He just said it kept the rain off." A harsh, bitter noise escaped Griggs's throat. It might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Kept the rain off," he echoed. He opened his eyes and looked at Riley. Really looked at her. "Do you know what this is, cadet?" "An anchor, sir," Riley said softly. Griggs turned sharply, his mechanical eye sweeping the line of perfect, polished cadets. "Do any of you shiny, pampered brats know what this is?" he roared. The sudden volume made Jax jump. Nobody spoke. Griggs turned back to Riley. He reached out and grabbed the shoulder of the jacket, his grip tight but not painful. "This is the insignia of the 3rd Orbital Drop Division. The iron anchors," Griggs said, his voice echoing off the metal bulkheads. "During the siege of Tartarus in the last years of the Galactic War, the Coalition abandoned them, left them in the mud and the acid rain to hold a choke point against 90,000 Krell warriors." Riley stared at him, her lips parted. "They didn't have thermal armor," Griggs continued, his voice dropping into a guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the frayed canvas. "They didn't have orbital support. They had canvas. They had rifles that jammed in the mud, and they held the line for 42 days. He let go of Riley's shoulder and took a step back. His chest heaved. 90% casualty rate," Griggs whispered. Though spoken quietly, in the dead silence of the room it carried to every corner. "The ones who came back. They ripped the wire from the Krell barricades and sewed it into their patches." A reminder. Griggs looked at Cassidy, then at Jax. His expression was a mask of cold, absolute disgust. "You mock this jacket," Griggs said, his voice deadly quiet. "You stand here in your climate-controlled suits paid for by your daddies, and you laugh at the blood of the men who gave you the right to breathe." Cassidy looked pale. She stared straight ahead, terrified to make eye contact. Griggs turned his attention back to Riley. The harshness in his face melted away, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it made Riley's chest ache. He slowly raised his hand, not to strike her, but to bring it to his brow. Instructor Griggs, the terror of the Zenith Academy, snapped a perfect razor-sharp salute. "Keep the jacket, Cadet Mercer," he said, his voice rough with unshed grief. "It's the only piece of real armor in this entire room." Riley didn't breathe until the prep room doors hissed shut behind Instructor Griggs. The heavy silence left in his wake was suffocating. She felt 50 pairs of eyes snap toward her, no longer filled with upper-crust disdain, but with a new, sharper kind of resentment. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt sick. Her grandfather had earned that salute. He had bled into the mud of a dead world, watching his friends burn alive while coalition politicians argued over supply budgets. Riley hadn't done anything. She was just wearing a dead man's ghost because she couldn't afford thermal weave. The heavy canvas on her shoulders suddenly felt like a slab of lead. "Don't think this changes anything, scavenger." Cassidy's voice was a low, venomous hiss. She had recovered her composure, her face a mask of pristine aristocratic fury. She stepped close enough that Riley could smell the synthetic lavender of her uniform's climate control exhaust. "Griggs is a broken old relic," Cassidy whispered, her eyes darting to the doors to ensure they were alone. "He gets off on poverty porn. Out in the field, nostalgia doesn't stop plasma burns. That jacket is going to get you killed, and when it does, I'm going to step right over you." Riley kept her eyes on the deck plating. She wanted to yell back. She wanted to tell Cassidy that her grandfather had forgotten more about survival than this spoiled brat would ever learn in a classroom. But the words withered in her throat. Cassidy wasn't entirely wrong. Riley had no formal training. She knew how to hotwire a fusion generator and patch a pressure seal with chewing gum and carbon tape. She didn't know how to fight a war. "Form up," a synthetic voice barked from the overhead speakers. "Simulation Chamber 3. 10 minutes. The prep room broke into frantic motion. Cadets grabbed their polished helmets and sleek magnetic rifles. Riley moved mechanically. She reached into her locker and pulled out her helmet. It was an old surplus mining rig painted a dull, chipped orange. The faceplate was scratched, and the internal comms crackled with permanent static. She shoved it onto her head. The familiar smell of stale air and ozone filled her nostrils. Smelled like home. It grounded her. Simulation Chamber 3 was a cavernous dome designed to replicate a hostile planetary surface. As the heavy blast doors ground open, a blast of hot, sulfurous air hit the cadets. The lighting was dialed down to a sickly twilight purple. The ground was jagged black basalt, covered in knee-deep drifts of synthetic gray ash. "Listen up, fresh meat," Griggs's voice echoed through their earpieces. The audio was intentionally distorted to mimic a degraded transmission. "Welcome to Cinder. The atmosphere is highly corrosive. Visibility is less than 20 meters. Your objective is simple. Locate the downed transport beacon in Sector 4, retrieve the data drive, and hold the perimeter until extraction. You have 60 minutes. If your suit seals fail, the simulation will paralyze your armor to simulate death. Don't die." A loud klaxon sounded. The simulation began. Cassidy immediately took the lead. She tapped her wrist console, projecting a crisp blue holographic map into the smoky air. "All right, squad," she ordered, her voice calm and authoritative. "My suit sensors have pinged the beacon's radioactive signature. We move in a standard diamond formation. Jacks take point. Rely on thermal imaging." "Copy that," Jack said. He flipped his visor down. A faint green light washed over his face. Riley trudged in the rear. Her oversized boots sank deep into the synthetic ash with every step. The heavy canvas jacket didn't have climate control. Within 5 minutes, she was sweating profusely, the salt stinging her eyes. She felt the chafing at her collarbone where the heavy fabric rubbed against her skin. They moved quickly for the first 10 minutes. Too quickly. The elite cadets trusted their HUDs implicitly, marching in a straight line toward the objective. Riley stopped. She crouched down, running a bare, grease-stained finger through the gray ash. It was too loose, and underneath the sulfur, she smelled something else. Ozone. Sharp and metallic. "Wait," Riley said over the squad channel. Cassidy stopped, turning around with an exaggerated sigh. "What is it, Mercer? Did your antique boots get a hole in them?" "The ground here is different," Riley said, ignoring the jab. She kept her voice flat. "It's not compacted. It's aerated, and the air smells ionized. My sensors show solid basalt beneath the ash layer," Jack scoffed, tapping his helmet. "The thermal read is completely flat. Nothing but cold rock. Sensors can be spoofed by heavy ion saturation," Riley muttered. Her grandfather used to say that. "Never trust a screen when your boots are telling you something different." "I think it's a trap." "We don't have time for your paranoia," Cassidy snapped. "The beacon is 300 meters ahead. Move." Jack stepped forward. The ground beneath him didn't just give way. It vanished with a deafening crack. The crust of basalt shattered. It wasn't solid rock. It was a thin crust over a deep thermal vent masked by a localized ion field. Jax fell waist-deep into a boiling pit of synthetic mud. "Ah, hell!" Jax yelled, his arms flailing as he tried to catch himself. The simulated mud was thick and magnetic. It immediately clung to the highly sensitive servos of his expensive armor. His suit's computer shrieked in his earpiece, warning of critical joint obstruction. Cassidy froze. Her perfect plan hadn't accounted for the ground swallowing her point man. "Jax, engage your microthrusters. Pull yourself up." "I can't." Jax panicked, thrashing harder, which only drove him deeper. "The mud is jamming the intakes. My right leg is completely locked." The smooth, synchronized hum of his elite armor turned into a violent grinding screech as the servos fought against the heavy magnetic sludge. "Cassidy, throw him a line," another cadet yelled. "I don't have a line," she shouted back, her composure cracking. "Our suits are rated for vertical evasion, not tethering." They were highly specialized, incredibly expensive, and utterly useless in the mud. Riley didn't think. She just moved. She unslung her heavy, outdated magnetic rifle and dropped it into the ash. She stomped forward, her oversized boots sliding on the shifting crust. The heat radiating from the vent was intense, baking the sweat onto her skin. "Mercer, get back," Cassidy ordered. "You don't have thermal shielding. The heat will fry your suit." Riley ignored her. She didn't have a suit to fry. She had canvas. Thick, heavy, heat-resistant canvas. She dropped to her knees right at the edge of the fractured crust. The jagged basalt bit through her pants, drawing a quick trickle of blood, but she didn't stop. "Give me your hand," Riley barked. Her voice wasn't a timid whisper anymore. It was a command, rough and abrasive. Jax looked up at her. His visor was splattered with gray mud. Panic made his eyes wide and white behind the glass. "It's pulling me down. The magnetic weight." "Shut up and grab my arm." Riley leaned over the edge, burying her left hand deep into the scorching ash to anchor herself. She thrust her right arm down. The sleeve of her jacket rolled back, revealing thin, pale arms corded with lean muscle built from years of hauling scrap metal. Jax reached up. His heavy armored gauntlet clamped onto her forearm. The weight was immense. It felt like her shoulder socket was going to tear violently apart. Riley gritted her teeth, a sharp, feral grunt escaping her lips. She tasted copper again. "Pull!" she screamed at the rest of the squad. "Don't just stand there. Grab my belt." Two of the cadets snapped out of their shock. They dropped into the ash, grabbing the thick leather harness strapped around Riley's waist. "On three," Riley gasped, her muscles burning with lactic acid. The heat from the vent was singeing her eyebrows. "1, 2, 3. They heaved backward. Jax's armor whined in protest, the locked servos snapping loudly. With a sickening squelch, he was ripped free from the magnetic mud. He tumbled over the edge, crashing into Riley. They rolled backward into the deep drifts of ash, panting heavily. Jax lay on his back. His pristine midnight blue armor was caked in thick gray sludge. His right leg was completely immobilized, stuck at a rigid angle. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Cassidy stood over them, her jaw tight. She looked at her holographic map, which was now violently flickering and spitting static. The ion storm is worsening. Comms are jamming. We need to leave him. Riley sat up, spitting a glob of gray ash from her mouth. She wiped her face with the back of her dirty hand, smearing soot across her cheek. Leave him. He's immobilized, Cassidy said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. The simulation rules dictate that if a squad member becomes a liability to the objective, they are to be abandoned. We are graded on mission success. This is a localized ion storm, Riley said, pointing at the swirling purple clouds gathering above them. In 10 minutes, your fancy visors are going to go completely blind. Your suits rely on continuous orbital telemetry. Without it, you're walking blind. I know how my armor works, Mercer, Cassidy snapped. No. Riley shot back, pushing herself to her feet. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder. You know how to read the manual. She walked over to Jax and dropped to one knee beside his locked leg. You don't know how it breaks. Riley pulled a thick flathead spanner from the thigh pocket of her canvas pants. It was heavy, chipped, and smelled like machine oil. What are you doing? Jax asked, his voice shaking. Your primary servo is jammed because magnetic silt bypassed the secondary seal, Riley muttered, her fingers tracing the intricate seams of the knee joint. She found the manual override housing. It was tiny, meant to be accessed in a clean room environment by a specialized diagnostic laser. Riley jammed the corner of her steel spanner into the seam and hit the back of it with the palm of her hand. Crack! The pristine casing popped off, revealing a mess of delicate wires and a fused locking pin. Hey, that voids the warranty, Jax protested weakly. You're welcome, Riley grunted. She jammed the spanner deeper, bypassing the delicate electronics entirely, and levered it against the titanium locking pin. She put her entire body weight onto the tool. Metal screamed against metal. With a loud snap, the pin sheared off. The knee joint instantly lost power, going completely limp. It's dead, Jax said, horrified. I have no power assist. But it bends, Riley said, grabbing his arm and hauling him upward. You walk on your own muscle now, just like a human. A mechanical siren wailed through the dome. Warning! Perimeter breach. Hostile elements inbound, the simulation voice announced. Through the thick, swirling ash, red optical sensors began to glow. Simulation combat drones. They moved silently, hovering just above the ground, their plasma repeaters charging with a high-pitched whine. Defensive positions, Cassidy yelled. She raised her rifle. Her HUD was glitching violently. I can't get a target lock. The ion interference is too thick. The elite cadets opened fire, but their shots went wide. Their smart rifles were trying to correct the trajectory based on faulty sensor data, sending plasma bolts harmlessly into the basalt walls. Riley didn't bother with her helmet's HUD. She pushed her visor up. The hot, sulfurous air stung her bare eyes. She picked up her heavy magnetic rifle from the ash. It was an archaic slug thrower, bulky and completely analog. It didn't have auto-aim. It didn't have thermal tracking. It just had iron sights. Riley braced the heavy stock against the thick canvas of her grandfather's jacket. She didn't look for heat signatures. She listened. She heard the faint, high-pitched whine of the drone's repulsor lifts cutting through the artificial wind. She watched for the subtle displacement of the falling ash. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched her shoulder hard. A tungsten slug tore through the thick air and shattered the central processing core of the lead drone. It dropped to the ground like a stone. They're flanking left, Riley shouted over the roar of the gunfire. She racked the bolt of her rifle manually, the heavy steel mechanism sliding back with a satisfying greasy clack. She fired again. Another drone sparked and went down. Cassidy stared at her, her own high-tech weapon completely useless in her hands. Riley didn't stop. She fired, racked the bolt, and fired again. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was muscle memory born from years of shooting scavenger rats in the dark ventilation shafts of New Anchorage. Her hands were black with gunpowder and ash. Sweat carved clean lines through the dirt on her face. She wasn't a pristine soldier. She was dirty. She was tired. But she was holding the line. High above the floor of the dome, in the observation deck, Instructor Griggs stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his cybernetic eye whirring, zooming in on the small girl in the oversized, faded olive-drab jacket. He watched her stand her ground in the blinding ash, her rifle barking a steady, unbroken rhythm of defiance. Griggs didn't smile. His scarred face remained as hard as ever. But slowly, imperceptibly, he nodded. Down in the dirt, Riley slammed a fresh magazine into her rifle. The canvas patch on her shoulder, the cracked silver anchor wrapped in rusted wire, was no longer a burden. As the barrel of her rifle smoked in the cold synthetic air, the Insignia finally felt like it belonged exactly where it was. Recoil bruised her collarbone. A dull ache settled deep into Riley's shoulder joint with every pull of the heavy trigger. She welcomed it. It meant the rifle was still cycling. It meant she wasn't dead. 3 more simulation drones fell from the purple haze, their repulsor lifts whining in a dying pitch as tungsten slugs tore blindly through their fragile logic centers. An empty brass casing clinked sharply against the basalt crust. Riley slapped her tactical belt blindly, hitting an empty canvas pouch. She had 3 rounds left in the chamber. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of scorched ozone and burning copper. "They're falling back," Jax gasped. He leaned heavily against a jagged rock outcropping, dragging his dead leg behind him. His arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by the raw, wide-eyed stare of a survivor realizing his own mortality. "They aren't falling back," Riley muttered. She wiped soot and blood from her cheek with her dirty sleeve. "They're making room." The ground trembled. It wasn't the localized shudder of a thermal vent. It was rhythmic, heavy. A massive, blocky silhouette pushed through the swirling ash. A siege-class breacher drone. It hovered low, its twin-linked plasma cannons glowing a furious, blinding yellow. Cassidy scrambled backward, her pristine boots slipping frantically. She raised her rifle, but it only let out a pathetic chirp as the ion storm finally bricked its motherboard completely. "We need to abort." Mercer, hit the emergency release sequence. Riley didn't move. She stared down the barrel of the mechanical behemoth. 3 tungsten slugs wouldn't even scratch that armor. Her grandfather's raspy voice echoed in her head, smelling heavily of cheap synth whiskey. Asterisk, if you can't punch through the wall, kid, make the floor disappear. Asterisk. She looked back at the thermal vent where Jax had nearly drowned. The crust was broken. The edges were dangerously unstable. "Jax!" Riley barked, eyes locked on the drone. "That manual release latch on your suit's thermal exhaust. Pull it." "What? Why?" "Just pull the damn latch." Jax fumbled blindly with his chest plate, his shaking fingers hooking the emergency purge valve. He yanked it hard. A thick plume of superheated steam hissed violently into the air, creating a dense thermal bloom in the twilight. The breacher drone stopped. Its optical sensors clicked rapidly, rotating toward the sudden burst of heat. To its primitive logic, the steam cloud registered as a large infantry cluster, pivoted and hovered directly toward Jax. "Hey!" Jax screamed, trying to drag his locked leg backward. "It's tracking me. Keep it distracted," Riley yelled. She broke into a dead sprint toward the drone. Her oversized boots dug clumsily into the ash. She slipped, her knees slamming hard into the jagged basalt. The rock tore through her heavy pants, scraping her skin raw. But she pushed off the ground, diving behind a narrow spine of rock, just as the drone unleashed a torrent of plasma fire. The air instantly turned into an oven. The rock behind her hissed, glowing cherry red. Heat radiated through the heavy canvas jacket. It was stifling, baking the sweat onto her skin. But it held. It didn't melt to her flesh like synthetic weave. It just smelled like burning rope. The drone was directly over the unstable crust now, advancing on the thermal cloud. Riley rolled out. She dropped to one knee, bracing the heavy wooden stock against the rusted wire of her insignia. She didn't aim at the heavily armored drone. She aimed at the ground beneath it. She exhaled slowly, watching the ash fall. She pulled the trigger. Bang! A tungsten slug bit into the fragile basalt edge. Bang! A second round widened the fracture, sending deep spiderwebs of cracking stone outward. The drone shifted its weight, preparing to fire another plasma barrage. Bang! Riley fired her last round directly into the center of the spiderweb. The crust shattered with a catastrophic crunch. The ground folded inward. The heavy repulsor lifts shrieked as they tried to compensate, but the localized ion field instantly choked their intake manifolds. The massive drone sank, firing its cannons blindly as the thick magnetic sludge swallowed its chassis. A muffled explosion shook the ground as its power core flooded with mud. Then, silence. The oppressive purple twilight snapped to a harsh, blinding white. The fluorescent lights buzzed back to life. The synthetic ash stopped falling. The deafening atmospheric scrubbers kicked into overdrive, clearing the room within seconds. Simulation terminated. Objective failed. Survival parameters met. The synthetic voice announced, devoid of inflection. Riley dropped the empty rifle. Her hands shook violently. She tasted vomit at the back of her throat and forced herself to swallow it down. Cassidy sat in the dirt. Her midnight blue armor was scuffed and coated in gray dust. She stared at her blank, useless rifle, looking incredibly small. Heavy boots hit the deck plating. Clank, clank, clank. Instructor Griggs walked into the simulation dome. He didn't look at the smoking crater. He walked straight toward Riley. Riley forced herself to stand, her legs feeling like wet sand. She braced herself for a brutal critique. Griggs stopped 2 feet away. He smelled heavily of tobacco and gun oil, a strangely comforting anchor. He looked at the smoking, obsolete rifle by her feet. Then his organic eye drifted up to her face. He didn't offer a grand speech. He reached into his deep pocket, pulled out a small object wrapped in oilcloth, and tossed it to her. Riley caught it clumsily. She peeled back the cloth to find a pristine brass-cased box of .308 tungsten slugs. Pure, unregistered analog ammunition. "Your stance is a mess, Mercer," Griggs grunted, his voice like crushed gravel. "And you shoot like a panicked mechanic." Riley blinked, looking down at the brass in her shaking hands. "Sir." Griggs turned slightly, his red cybernetic lens focusing on the faded insignia on her shoulder. The cracked anchor wrapped in barbed wire. "But your grandfather would have called it a passing grade," Griggs said softly. He gave her a single, sharp nod. "Respect. For the living." Griggs turned and walked toward the exit. "Class dismissed. Mercer, clean your weapon. The rest of you start drafting your failure reports." Riley stood alone in the settling ash. The heavy canvas jacket clung to her sweaty back, chafing her neck. It was uncomfortable, dirty, and reeked of smoke. She ran a blackened, grease-stained thumb over the rusted wire. It wasn't a gravestone anymore. It was armor. That concludes the epic story of Riley and the Iron Anchors. Sometimes the oldest gear holds the strongest legacy. If this gritty, grounded sci-fi tale kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more original audio dramas. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and leave a comment below. Would you trust an antique rifle over smart armor? See you in the next universe.